Hi, fellow history explorers. Today, we're on a mission to dig up the fascinating stories of history.
The era of the Conquistadors stands as one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of exploration and conquest. During the 16th century, a group of audacious and determined adventurers, known as the Conquistadors, embarked on perilous journeys to the New World. Led by their insatiable thirst for riches, power, and a desire to spread Christianity, these Spanish conquistadors left an indelible mark on the Americas. This account delves deep into their exploits, motivations, and the consequences of their actions, shedding light on the complex legacy they left behind. Background and motivations. In the early 16th century, Spain was a nation marked by a tumultuous blend of political instability and boundless economic ambition. It was a period characterized by the culmination of several factors that would converge to propel Spain into the forefront of global exploration and conquest. To truly understand the emergence and motivations of the conquistadors, one must delve into the rich tapestry of Spain's historical context during this era. At the heart of Spain's political landscape in the 16th century was the completion of the Reconquista, a centuries-long campaign to recapture the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim control. This struggle had been a defining feature of Spanish history since the early medieval period, when Islamic forces had swept across the peninsula. However, by the late 15th century, the tide had turned decisively in favor of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. In 1492, they achieved a momentous victory by capturing Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, thereby bringing the Reconquista to a triumphant conclusion. The Reconquista left an indelible mark on Spain's collective psyche. It had been a protracted and grueling struggle that demanded significant resources, manpower, and determination. The conquest of Muslim territories was not merely a territorial endeavor, but a spiritual and ideological one as well. The Reconquista was framed as a holy crusade, with the Catholic faith pitted against Islam. The fervor of religious zeal permeated the Spanish society of the time, forging a deep connection between faith and national identity. This religious zealotry had a profound influence on the conquistadors and their motivations. The fall of Granada in 1492 had not only marked the end of Muslim rule, but also coincided with Christopher Columbus's epochal voyage to the New World. Columbus, often considered the harbinger of the conquistadors, ventured into the unknown with a commission from the Catholic monarchs. He set sail under the banners of gold, glory, and God, the three driving motivations that would propel countless Spanish explorers and adventurers into the New World. Gold symbolized the pursuit of riches and economic opportunity. The discovery of precious metals in the New World was not merely a chance windfall. It was a fundamental part of the conquistadors' motivation. Spain had long been grappling with economic challenges, including mounting debts incurred during the Reconquista and other wars. The prospect of unearthing vast reserves of gold and silver in the New World promised to alleviate these financial burdens and position Spain as a formidable global power. Glory was another driving force, intertwined with the desire for personal and national prestige. The conquistadors were inspired by the legends of past Spanish heroes who had fought in the Reconquista, and they aspired to carve their names into history by achieving remarkable feats in the New World. The conquest of great empires, such as the Aztec and Inca civilizations, offered the opportunity for enduring renown. Perhaps the most enduring motivation for the conquistadors was their sense of divine purpose. The notion of spreading Christianity was deeply ingrained in their psyche. The Reconquista's religious overtones had reinforced the idea that their actions were not only motivated by personal ambition, but were also a sacred duty. The conquistadors believed that by converting indigenous peoples to Christianity, they were not only fulfilling their spiritual obligations, but also advancing the cause of their nation. The First Conquistadors. The conquistadors who embarked on the perilous journeys to the New World during the 16th century were a diverse group of individuals, each with their own unique qualities and motivations. Among the first conquistadors, Three figures stand out prominently: Christopher Columbus, Hernán Cortés, and Francisco Pizarro. Each of these men played a pivotal role in the early conquests and exploration of the Americas, leaving an indelible mark on history. Christopher Columbus, often hailed as the discoverer of the New World, was an Italian explorer sailing under the Spanish flag. Born in Genoa in 1451, Columbus came from a humble background but possessed a deep-seated ambition to find a westward route to Asia, which he believed would be a shortcut to the riches of the East. In 1492, after numerous attempts to secure support for his audacious voyage, Columbus finally received backing from the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. Setting sail on the Santa Maria, along with the Nina and Pinta, Columbus embarked on a voyage that would alter the course of history. On October 12, 1492, he made landfall in the present-day Bahamas, mistakenly believing he had reached the shores of Asia. This accidental discovery marked the beginning of European exploration in the Americas. Columbus's subsequent voyages deepened European knowledge of the Caribbean islands and the mainland of Central and South America, although he remained convinced that he had reached Asia. While Columbus's voyages opened the door to the New World, it was Hernán Cortés who would become one of the most audacious and successful conquistadors. Born in 1485 in Medellin, Spain, Cortés was a man of ambition and daring. In 1519, he led an expedition to Mexico, where he encountered the powerful Aztec Empire ruled by Moctezuma I. Cortés, with a small force of Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies, embarked on a campaign that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Aztec civilization. Cortés's success in the conquest of the Aztecs can be attributed to a combination of military skill, shrewd diplomacy, and a measure of good fortune. He forged alliances with indigenous groups who were eager to overthrow Aztec rule, and he exploited internal divisions within the Aztec Empire. The capture of Moctezuma I, who was initially held captive by Cortés, further weakened Aztec resistance. After a protracted siege, the Spanish and their allies overran the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, in 1521. This marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Americas, as it marked the beginning of Spanish domination in the region. Francisco Pizarro, born around 1471 in Trujillo, Spain, was another conquistador whose exploits would leave an indelible mark on the New World. Pizarro is perhaps best known for his conquest of the Inca Empire, which was located in the Andes Mountains of South America. In 1532, Pizarro and his small band of soldiers arrived in the Inca heartland, where they encountered the Inca ruler Atahualpa. Through a combination of cunning tactics and treachery, Pizarro managed to capture Atahualpa, despite being heavily outnumbered. Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire was characterized by brutality, betrayal, and a relentless pursuit of riches. The Spanish looted vast quantities of gold and silver from the Inca, leading to a catastrophic collapse of the Inca civilization. The capture and execution of Atahualpa in 1533 marked the symbolic end of Inca resistance. Pizarro went on to establish the city of Lima as the capital of Spanish Peru, solidifying Spanish control over the region. Cortés Expedition. The expedition led by Hernán Cortés to Mexico in the early 16th century stands as one of the most audacious and consequential episodes in the history of exploration and conquest. It was a venture characterized by boldness, cunning diplomacy, and the clash of civilizations. This narrative delves into the intricate details of Cortés' expedition, beginning with the landing in Mexico, his alliance with indigenous groups, and culminating in the fall of Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire. The landing of Hernán Cortés and his small expeditionary force on the coast of what is now Mexico in April 1519 marked the inception of a new era. They disembarked at a place called Potonchan, and soon, Cortés made it clear to his men that there was no turning back. In a calculated move, Cortés ordered the scuttling of his ships, thereby eliminating the possibility of retreat and leaving his men with no option but to forge ahead into the unknown. This bold act had a profound psychological impact on his troops, effectively solidifying their commitment to the expedition. Cortés and his men, numbering around 600, including conquistadors and sailors, were now faced with the immense challenge of navigating and conquering a vast and densely populated land. The indigenous peoples of Mexico had a rich history and complex societies, and Cortés was acutely aware that the odds were stacked against him. One of the most pivotal aspects of Cortés' success in Mexico was his ability to form strategic alliances with indigenous groups. Among the key figures in this regard was a remarkable woman named Malintzin, known as La Malinche. She was an indigenous woman from the Nahua-speaking peoples of Mexico who had been captured and enslaved by an enemy tribe before eventually coming into the possession of Cortés. Fluent in multiple indigenous languages and possessing a deep understanding of the local cultures, La Malinche became Cortés' indispensable interpreter and advisor. La Malinche's role in Cortés' expedition cannot be overstated. Through her, Cortés was able to communicate with various indigenous groups, forging alliances and gathering crucial intelligence about the political landscape of Mexico. Her knowledge of local customs, politics, and languages made her an invaluable asset to the Spanish. La Malinche's contribution extended beyond mere translation. She acted as a mediator, diplomat, and negotiator, helping Cortés secure the support of indigenous allies, particularly the Tlaxcalans. The conquest of the Aztec Empire, under the rule of Moctezuma II, was the central objective of Cortés' expedition. The Spanish, aided by their indigenous allies, embarked on a journey inland, marching towards the heart of the Aztec civilization. Along the way, they faced resistance and skirmishes with Aztec forces, but the alliance with indigenous groups, particularly the Tlaxcalans, proved to be a decisive advantage. The culmination of Cortés' expedition was the siege and ultimate destruction of Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the Aztec Empire. After a series of diplomatic maneuverings and confrontations, Cortés and his forces managed to enter the city in November 1519, where they were initially welcomed by Moctezuma II. However, tensions escalated, and the relationship between the Spanish and the Aztecs deteriorated. The siege of Tenochtitlan, which began in earnest in 1521, was a protracted and grueling affair. The city was a marvel of engineering, built on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by causeways. Cortés' forces faced formidable resistance, and the siege exacted a heavy toll on both sides. The Spanish utilized superior weaponry, including cannons and muskets, as well as their indigenous allies to lay siege to the city. Ultimately, after months of intense fighting, famine, and disease, Tenochtitlan fell to the Spanish in August 1521. The Aztec capital was razed to the ground, marking the end of one of the most remarkable empires in the Americas. Moctezuma I was killed during the siege, and the surviving Aztec nobility was subjected to Spanish rule. Impact and legacy. The impact and legacy of the conquistadors in the wake of their conquests, particularly in the case of Hernán Cortés in Mexico, are multifaceted and complex, echoing through the annals of history and profoundly shaping the course of human events in the early modern period. One of the most immediate consequences of Cortés' conquest of the Aztec Empire was the establishment of the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1535. This administrative entity, under the Spanish Crown's authority, encompassed a vast territory that stretched from present-day Mexico to parts of Central America and the southwestern United States. It became one of the most important and lucrative regions in the Spanish Empire, yielding enormous wealth in the form of precious metals, particularly silver from mines like Potosi, and agricultural products such as sugarcane. The establishment of New Spain had far-reaching effects, not only in terms of territorial expansion, but also regarding the introduction of Spanish institutions, governance, and culture into the New World. The Spanish crown sought to exert control over its newfound territories through a hierarchical system of colonial administration. The viceroy, appointed by the king, was the highest authority in New Spain and governed with a blend of Spanish law, military power, and the cooperation of local elites. Spanish colonists, drawn by the allure of riches, began arriving in large numbers, and encomiendas were granted to Spanish settlers, giving them control over indigenous labor and resources. This system often led to the exploitation and mistreatment of indigenous populations, as they were forced to work in mines, plantations, and other labor-intensive activities. The encomienda system was a source of significant conflict and controversy, eventually leading to legal reforms aimed at protecting indigenous rights. Another profound and enduring consequence of the conquistadors' arrival was the clash of civilizations. The encounter between the Old World and the New World was marked by a cataclysmic exchange of diseases, plants, animals, and cultures, a phenomenon known as the Columbian Exchange. The introduction of European diseases, such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the indigenous populations had no immunity, led to devastating epidemics that decimated their numbers. This demographic catastrophe, along with warfare and forced labor, led to a precipitous decline in indigenous populations across the Americas. Simultaneously, the Spanish brought horses, cattle, wheat, and other European crops, fundamentally altering the diets and ways of life of indigenous peoples. The Columbian Exchange had global ramifications, as new foods and products from the Americas, such as maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and chocolate, transformed cuisines and economies worldwide. The military conquest and the imposition of Spanish rule also engendered a profound cultural fusion, often referred to as mestizaje, which denotes the blending of Spanish and indigenous cultures. This fusion occurred on multiple levels, encompassing language, religion, art, cuisine, and social customs. The Spanish crown, the Catholic Church, and various religious orders played a central role in this process. The Franciscans and Dominicans, for example, undertook extensive efforts to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, building churches, monasteries, and schools throughout the new colonies. One of the most notable aspects of cultural fusion was the creation of a new mestizo identity. Mestizos were individuals of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage who occupied a unique place in colonial society. They played critical roles as intermediaries, bridging the gap between Spanish colonizers and indigenous communities, often serving as translators, traders, and community leaders. The melding of Spanish and indigenous cultures also found expression in art and architecture. Indigenous artisans incorporated European techniques and materials into their traditional crafts, creating a distinctive hybrid style known as Mexican Baroque. This artistic fusion produced magnificent works of art and architecture, exemplified by the elaborate facades of churches and cathedrals in Mexico City and other colonial cities. Pizarro's expedition. The expedition led by Francisco Pizarro to conquer the Inca Empire in the early 16th century was a remarkable and perilous undertaking that tested the limits of human endurance and ambition. Pizarro's journey through the formidable Andes Mountains, the capture of Atahualpa, and the establishment of Lima as the capital of Spanish Peru all stand as pivotal episodes in the history of conquest and colonization. The trek through the Andes was one of the most grueling and arduous challenges faced by Pizarro and his men. Beginning in 1532, Pizarro and his force of around 180 Spanish conquistadors and several thousand indigenous allies set out from the coast of present-day Ecuador, with the ultimate goal of reaching the heartland of the Inca Empire. This journey would take them through some of the most rugged and treacherous terrain on the planet. The Andes Mountains are a formidable natural barrier, with towering peaks, deep valleys, and a harsh climate. Pizarro's expedition faced numerous challenges, including extreme altitude, freezing temperatures, and scarce provisions. The lack of suitable beasts of burden meant that much of the expedition's supplies had to be carried by indigenous boarders, adding to the logistical difficulties. The march through the Andes tested the resilience and determination of Pizarro's men, pushing them to the brink of exhaustion and despair. Despite these adversities, Pizarro's expedition persevered, driven by the lure of unimaginable riches rumored to exist in the Inca Empire. Along their journey, the Spanish encountered various indigenous groups, some of whom were hostile, while others were willing to provide support in exchange for the promise of aid against the Inca ruler Atahualpa, who was seen as a tyrant by many. The capture of Atahualpa in November 1532 marked a pivotal moment in Inca history and in Pizarro's conquest. Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, had recently emerged victorious from a devastating civil war against his brother, Huáscar. However, his triumph was short-lived as he found himself confronted by Pizarro's small but determined force. The capture of Atahualpa was orchestrated through a combination of strategic cunning and betrayal. Pizarro invited Atahualpa to meet with him in the city of Cajamarca, where Pizarro had set a trap. On the day of the meeting, Pizarro's men, hidden within buildings, ambushed Atahualpa's retinue, taking the Inca ruler captive. This audacious move stunned the Inca, who were unaccustomed to such military tactics. Atahualpa's capture had profound consequences for the Inca Empire. With their ruler in Spanish custody, the Inca were thrown into disarray. Atahualpa offered to fill a room with gold and twice with silver in exchange for his release, which he believed would secure his freedom. However, despite receiving this enormous ransom, Pizarro ultimately executed Atahualpa in 1533, fearing that he could become a rallying point for Inca resistance. The establishment of Lima, known as the City of Kings, in 1535 marked a critical step in the consolidation of Spanish power in the Andean region. Pizarro chose the site for its strategic location on the coast, which facilitated communication and trade with Spain and other Spanish colonies. Lima soon became a hub of colonial administration, commerce, and culture. The city was meticulously planned, featuring a grid layout with a central plaza and grand buildings, including a cathedral and a palace for the Spanish viceroy. Its strategic location also allowed for efficient control of the surrounding territories and the exploitation of nearby resources. Lima's founding and subsequent growth signaled the beginning of a new era in the Andean region, as Spanish influence began to supplant the once mighty Inca Empire. The Spanish Empire in South America. The Spanish Empire in South America, with its epicenter in the Viceroyalty of Peru, represented a formidable imperial presence that reshaped the social, economic, and cultural landscapes of the continent. This era was marked by the consolidation of Spanish power, the exploitation of rich resources, particularly in the form of silver mining, and the indigenous response to Spanish rule, which included both passive adaptation and active resistance. The Viceroyalty of Peru, established in 1542, was a sprawling administrative entity that covered much of present-day Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and parts of Colombia, Chile, and Argentina. Its capital, Lima, became a symbol of Spanish authority and grandeur in the New World. The Viceroyalty was governed by a viceroy, representing the King of Spain, and it boasted a complex bureaucracy, a legal system derived from Spanish law, and an extensive network of religious institutions. Lima, in particular, became a hub of colonial administration and culture. It was adorned with grand churches, monasteries, and palaces, many of which still stand today as architectural treasures. The city's central plaza, flanked by these imposing structures, served as a gathering place for both the Spanish elite and indigenous populations, and it became a focal point for cultural exchange. One of the primary driving forces behind the Spanish Empire in South America was the exploitation of its vast resources. Silver mining, in particular, played a central role in the economic and political dynamics of the Viceroyalty. The discovery of the Potosi silver mines in present-day Bolivia in 1545 marked a turning point. The mines at Potosi were some of the richest in the world, and they became a source of immense wealth for the Spanish crown. Silver from Potosi was shipped to Lima, and then on to Spain, where it fueled the Spanish economy and financed European wars. The extraction of silver was a labor-intensive process, and the Spanish established the Mita system to secure a steady supply of indigenous labor. Under the Mita, indigenous communities were required to provide a quota of laborers who would work in the mines for a specified period. This system, while providing a source of revenue for the indigenous communities, also imposed a heavy burden on them. The harsh working conditions, combined with the exposure to toxic materials in the mines, led to a high mortality rate among indigenous laborers. The Mita system was part of a broader pattern of exploitation that extended beyond the mines. Indigenous communities were subjected to forced labor in agriculture, textile production, and construction, among other tasks. The Spanish crown, in its quest for wealth, often prioritized short-term gains over the well-being of indigenous populations. The indigenous response to Spanish rule in South America was multifaceted. It included both passive adaptation and active resistance. Some indigenous communities sought to preserve their cultural practices and traditions by blending them with Spanish customs, a process known as syncretism. This led to the emergence of a hybrid culture that combined indigenous and European elements, particularly in art, religion, and language. However, resistance to Spanish rule was also widespread. Indigenous uprisings and rebellions occurred throughout the Viceroyalty's history. The most famous of these was the Great Rebellion of 1780, led by Tupac Amaru in Peru. This massive uprising, which involved indigenous and mestizo, mixed-race, populations, was a response to the harsh treatment and heavy taxation imposed by Spanish authorities. Although the rebellion was eventually crushed, it underscored the persistent grievances of indigenous populations. In addition to armed resistance, indigenous peoples also utilized other strategies to assert their agency. These included legal challenges, petitions to the Spanish crown, and the preservation of oral traditions that kept alive their pre-Columbian histories and worldviews. Lesser-known conquests. The lesser-known conquests of the 16th century were marked by a spirit of adventure, exploration, and conquest that extended far beyond the famous exploits of figures like Cortés and Pizarro. Among the lesser-known conquistadors who ventured into the New World, Juan Ponce de Leon, Hernando de Soto, and Francisco de Orellana each embarked on remarkable journeys that significantly contributed to the broader narrative of European exploration and colonization in the Americas. Juan Ponce de Leon's quest for the mythical Fountain of Youth in Florida epitomizes the allure and mystique of the New World for the early Spanish explorers. Born in 1474 in Spain, Ponce de Leon had already distinguished himself in Christopher Columbus's second voyage to the Americas in 1493. However, it was his later search for the Fountain of Youth that would cement his place in history. In 1513, Ponce de Leon sailed from Puerto Rico to what is now Florida. He was motivated by legends of a mythical spring that could restore youth to those who bathed in its waters. Although the quest for the Fountain of Youth has been often dismissed as a fanciful and futile endeavor, it reflected the prevailing beliefs and ambitions of the time. Ponce de Leon's arrival in Florida marked the first recorded European exploration of the eastern coast of North America. He claimed the land for Spain and named it La Florida, due to the lush vegetation he encountered. Ponce de Leon's explorations did not yield the fabled Fountain of Youth, but they did contribute to Spain's expanding knowledge of the New World. His encounters with indigenous populations, particularly the Calusa people in Florida, also demonstrated the challenges and complexities of European indigenous interactions. Ponce de Leon's explorations laid the foundation for further Spanish expeditions into what would become the southeastern United States. Hernando de Soto's expedition through the southeastern United States represents another lesser-known conquest that had a profound impact on the region's history. De Soto, born in Spain around 1500, had previously participated in Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire. In 1539, he set out on an ambitious expedition to explore and conquer the southeastern part of North America, known as La Florida, which extended far beyond the borders of present-day Florida. De Soto's expedition was characterized by its sheer scale and audacity. He led a force of over 600 conquistadors, along with hundreds of indigenous allies, on a journey that took them through what are now the states of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. This was a vast and uncharted territory, and the expedition faced numerous challenges, including hostile encounters with indigenous peoples and the rigors of traversing unexplored terrain. While De Soto's expedition did not find the riches they had hoped for, it had a profound impact on the region's history. The Spanish presence and interactions with indigenous populations left a lasting imprint, contributing to the transmission of European diseases and the disruption of indigenous societies. De Soto himself died in 1542, and the remnants of his expedition eventually made their way to Mexico. However, the legacy of his journey would persist in the collective memory of the southeastern United States. Francisco de Orellana's journey down the Amazon River, which took place later in the 16th century, represented another remarkable but lesser-known chapter in the annals of Spanish exploration. Orellana, born around 1511 in Spain, had been part of Gonzalo Pizarro's expedition in search of El Dorado, the legendary city of gold in the Andes. When that expedition ended in disaster, Orellana and his men found themselves stranded and starving. In a desperate bid for survival, Orellana and a small group of his men built a small vessel and set out down the Coca River, a tributary of the Amazon, in 1541. This journey, fraught with peril and hardship, would eventually lead them to the mighty Amazon River itself. Orellana's expedition became the first known European journey down the length of the Amazon. The voyage was fraught with danger, as Orellana and his men encountered indigenous tribes, navigated treacherous waters, and faced numerous hardships. They struggled against hostile tribes, adverse weather conditions, and diseases. Along the way, Orellana and his men observed and documented the diverse cultures and ecosystems of the Amazon basin. The journey down the Amazon was one of survival and exploration, and it ultimately brought Orellana and his men to the Atlantic Ocean in 1542, where they were rescued by a Spanish ship. Orellana returned to Spain, where he reported on his remarkable journey and the vastness of the Amazon River. The Conquistadors Impact. The impact of the conquistadors on the New World and the broader course of world history is a multifaceted and contentious subject, encompassing complex interactions and legacies that continue to shape our understanding of this pivotal period. The legacy of the conquistadors is marked by the Columbian Exchange, the spread of Christianity, and a debate that rages on about whether they should be remembered as heroes or villains. The Columbian Exchange stands as one of the most significant consequences of the conquistadors' arrival in the New World. It was a transformative global exchange of goods, crops, cultures, and ideas that began with Christopher Columbus's voyages and extended well beyond the initial conquests. This exchange had profound and lasting effects on both the Old World and the New. One of the most striking aspects of the Columbian Exchange was the transfer of agricultural products between the two hemispheres. The introduction of New World crops such as maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and peppers to the Old World revolutionized European diets and agricultural practices. These new staples enriched diets, increased agricultural productivity, and contributed to significant population growth in Europe. Conversely, the Old World introduced crops like wheat, rice, sugarcane, and coffee to the New World. These crops, along with the domestication of animals like cattle and horses, transformed indigenous economies and societies. The exchange of goods, including precious metals, textiles, and spices, further intertwined the economies of Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. While the Columbian Exchange brought material benefits, it also had devastating consequences. The exchange of diseases, particularly European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, had catastrophic effects on indigenous populations in the Americas. These diseases, to which Native Americans had no immunity, caused staggering mortality rates and depopulated entire regions. This demographic catastrophe, combined with the violence and exploitation wrought by the conquistadors, led to the decline of advanced indigenous civilizations and the emergence of new social and cultural landscapes. Another profound impact of the conquistadors was the spread of Christianity, particularly Catholicism, in the New World. The Spanish crown saw the conversion of indigenous populations as both a religious and political objective. Missionaries played a pivotal role in this process, establishing churches, monasteries, and schools throughout the Americas. They worked to convert indigenous people to Christianity, often through a combination of persuasion, coercion, and cultural adaptation. The spread of Christianity brought about profound changes in indigenous religious practices, worldviews, and social structures. Indigenous beliefs and deities were often syncretized with Christian elements, leading to the emergence of hybrid religious traditions. This process also included the preservation of indigenous languages and customs, which were sometimes incorporated into Christian rituals and liturgy. The conquistadors' role in spreading Christianity remains a topic of historical debate. While some argue that the missionaries' efforts were genuine attempts to save souls, others contend that conversion was often accompanied by the suppression of indigenous cultures and the imposition of European values. The debate over whether the conquistadors should be celebrated as bringers of the Christian faith or condemned for the cultural upheaval they instigated continues to generate discussion among historians and scholars. The question of whether the conquistadors should be remembered as heroes or villains remains a contentious issue. Their actions encompass a wide spectrum of behaviors, from audacious exploration to brutal conquest and exploitation. While some conquistadors, such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, are celebrated for their daring exploits, others are reviled for their ruthlessness and the suffering they inflicted on indigenous populations. It is essential to recognize that the conquistadors were not a monolithic group. Their motivations, actions, and legacies varied widely. Some conquistadors sought wealth and glory, while others were driven by religious fervor or a sense of duty. Indigenous perspectives on the conquistadors are also diverse, as some indigenous groups allied with the Spanish, while others resisted their intrusion with all their might. In the modern era, the debate over the conquistadors' legacy extends beyond academia. It carries implications for questions of identity, justice, and reconciliation in the Americas. Efforts to acknowledge and address the historical injustices inflicted upon indigenous populations, as well as to preserve and celebrate indigenous cultures, are ongoing. Rivalries and conflicts. The era of the conquistadors was not only marked by the dramatic conquests and exploration of the New World, but also by internal rivalries, conflicts over the encomienda system, and the implementation of legal reforms that attempted to regulate the conduct of Spanish colonists in the Americas. These elements, intertwined with the broader narrative of Spanish conquest and colonization, shed light on the complex dynamics of this transformative period. Internal rivalries among the conquistadors were a prominent feature of the early Spanish expeditions in the Americas. These rivalries were often driven by personal ambition, the pursuit of wealth and glory, and the desire for recognition and titles from the Spanish crown. The competition for prestige and the spoils of conquest created tensions and conflicts within the ranks of the conquistadors themselves. Hernán Cortés' expedition to Mexico provides a notable example of internal rivalries. Cortés, who famously led the conquest of the Aztec Empire, faced challenges from his own subordinates, such as Diego Velázquez, who initially sponsored Cortés' expedition, but later sought to assert control over it. Cortés' authority and leadership were repeatedly questioned and contested by those who coveted the rewards of conquest. Similarly, in the case of Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire, internal rivalries and conflicts were pervasive. Pizarro's own brothers, Gonzalo and Hernando Pizarro, vied for power and influence, leading to infighting and political maneuvering. The tensions within the Pizarro expedition culminated in the assassination of the Inca ruler Atahualpa and a power struggle for control over the newly conquered territories. These internal rivalries not only complicated the conquests but also had significant consequences for the governance and administration of the newly acquired territories. They underscored the individualism and opportunism of the conquistadors, who often prioritized their personal ambitions over collective goals or the interests of the Spanish crown. One of the most contentious issues that emerged in the wake of the conquests was the encomienda system. The encomienda was a system of labor and tribute in which Spanish colonists, known as encomenderos, were granted the right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities in exchange for protection and religious instruction. In theory, the encomienda was intended to facilitate the assimilation of indigenous populations into Spanish society. In practice, it often amounted to a system of forced labor and exploitation. Conflicts over the encomienda system were common, as it became a source of abuse and oppression. Many encomenderos subjected indigenous populations to harsh working conditions, forced conversions to Christianity, and excessive tribute demands. Indigenous communities were often subjected to cruelty and exploitation, leading to resistance and revolts. One of the most significant conflicts over the encomienda system occurred in the early 16th century with the passage of the Laws of the Indies and the New Laws of the Indies. These legal reforms, issued by the Spanish crown, aimed to regulate the treatment of indigenous populations in the Americas and address the abuses of the encomienda system. The Laws of the Indies, promulgated in the early 16th century, laid out regulations for the treatment of indigenous peoples, emphasizing their protection and conversion to Christianity. These laws sought to mitigate some of the worst abuses of the encomienda system and establish guidelines for just governance in the colonies. However, enforcement of these laws often proved challenging, as the colonial administration was distant from Spain, and the interests of encomenderos frequently clashed with the crown's directives. The New Laws of the Indies, issued in 1542, represented a more comprehensive and forceful attempt to reform colonial governance and labor practices. These laws were driven by humanitarian concerns and a desire to curtail the exploitation of indigenous populations. They aimed to limit the power of encomenderos, protect indigenous communities from forced labor, and ensure their just treatment. The implementation of the New Laws of the Indies sparked significant backlash from encomenderos and colonial elites who saw their economic interests threatened. Protests and opposition to the laws led to conflicts and political turmoil in the colonies. Ultimately, the enforcement of these laws varied across different regions, and their impact was uneven. The Twilight Years. The period known as the Twilight Years of the Conquistadors marks the final chapter in the lives and legacies of the first generation of Spanish conquistadors who had played pivotal roles in the conquest and colonization of the Americas. This phase, spanning the late 16th and early 17th centuries, saw the passing of many of these legendary figures and the gradual fading of their once dazzling achievements in the annals of history. The end of an era in the Americas was marked by the passing of key conquistadors who had left an indelible mark on the New World. These individuals, whose names had become synonymous with the age of conquest, included Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, and Gonzalo Pizarro. Hernán Cortés, the conqueror of the Aztec Empire, passed away in 1547 in Spain, a decade after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Francisco Pizarro, who had similarly conquered the Inca Empire, met a violent end when he was assassinated in Lima in 1541. Gonzalo Pizarro, who had led the disastrous Amazon expedition, was executed for his role in rebellion against Spanish authorities in 1548. The passing of these and other conquistadors marked the end of an era defined by daring exploits, audacious exploration, and the ruthless pursuit of wealth and glory. Their stories, filled with tales of adventure, conquest, and ambition, had captured the imaginations of contemporaries and later generations alike. These men had become legendary figures, celebrated as heroes who expanded the frontiers of the known world. However, as the first generation of conquistadors passed from the scene, their legacy began to fade and undergo a transformation. The conquests and exploits of the conquistadors had unleashed a torrent of historical change in the Americas, characterized by the wholesale transformation of indigenous societies, the introduction of new cultures and religions, and the relentless pursuit of wealth. Yet, as the centuries progressed, the achievements of the conquistadors started to be viewed through different lenses. The initial awe and admiration for the conquistadors' daring exploits gave way to a more critical and nuanced assessment of their actions. The conquests had come at a tremendous cost, with devastating consequences for indigenous populations in terms of disease, displacement, and exploitation. This darker side of the conquistadors' legacy began to receive greater attention as historians and scholars delved into the complexities of the era. Furthermore, the legacy of the conquistadors was overshadowed by broader historical forces. By the late 16th century, the Spanish Empire was no longer solely defined by the heroic deeds of the first generation of conquistadors. The empire had grown and evolved, encompassing vast territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. It had also become deeply entrenched in complex administrative structures, bureaucratic systems, and economic enterprises. The focus had shifted from individual feats of conquest to the maintenance and governance of a sprawling global empire. In this evolving context, the exploits of the conquistadors came to be seen as a prelude to a much larger story of imperial expansion, colonization, and cultural exchange. The legacy of the conquistadors was gradually subsumed within the broader narrative of Spanish colonialism, which encompassed centuries of history, including the rise and fall of colonial empires, the exploitation of resources, and the enduring impact on indigenous cultures. As the conquistadors' achievements were reevaluated and contextualized within the larger historical framework, they became emblematic of a bygone era, a time of audacious exploration and conquest that had laid the foundations for a global empire. Their legacies, once celebrated without reservation, were now subject to scrutiny and debate, reflecting changing perspectives on colonialism, indigenous rights, and historical memory. Conclusion. The saga of the conquistadors, a remarkable chapter in the annals of human history, stands as a testament to the indomitable spirit of exploration, ambition, and conquest that characterized the age of discovery in the early modern period. These intrepid adventurers, driven by a relentless pursuit of riches, glory, and conquest, embarked on audacious journeys that irrevocably altered the course of history. Their expeditions extended the boundaries of the Spanish Empire to previously unimaginable dimensions, introduced new cultures and products to both hemispheres, and left an indelible imprint on the destinies of countless indigenous peoples. The conquistadors' legacy, however, is far from unambiguous. It is a legacy that continues to elicit contrasting emotions and judgments, encapsulating the duality of human nature and the complexities of historical interpretation. On one hand, they are celebrated as daring explorers and adventurers who ventured into the unknown, challenging the limits of human endurance and geographical knowledge. They are admired for their audacity, their ability to overcome insurmountable odds, and their role in expanding the frontiers of the known world. The conquistadors were, in many ways, emblematic of an era marked by boundless ambition, exploration, and a thirst for the unknown. On the other hand, the conquistadors are also vilified as brutal oppressors who wrought havoc upon indigenous populations. Their expeditions brought diseases that decimated native communities, and their pursuit of wealth led to widespread exploitation, violence, and forced labor. The conquests resulted in the collapse of advanced indigenous civilizations, the destruction of cultural heritage, and the imposition of European values and beliefs. The suffering and injustices inflicted upon indigenous peoples by the conquistadors cannot be understated, and their actions have been a subject of moral and ethical scrutiny. The conquistadors' story serves as a poignant reminder of the complex interplay of ambition, power, and humanity that defines the age of exploration. It illustrates the heights to which human ambition can soar when driven by the promise of wealth, fame, and conquest, as well as the depths to which it can descend when unchecked by moral and ethical considerations. The conquests of the New World were not merely driven by the pursuit of riches, but were also steeped in the politics, rivalries, and aspirations of the European powers of the time. The legacy of the conquistadors extends beyond the narratives of individual conquests and the contours of specific expeditions. It resonates in the ongoing discussions of colonialism, indigenous rights, and historical memory. The conquests, for all their cruelty and suffering, also facilitated the mingling of cultures, the exchange of ideas, and the introduction of new crops and technologies that continue to shape the modern world. The conquistadors left an indelible mark on the Americas, Europe, and the world at large, a legacy that remains a subject of scholarly inquiry, artistic interpretation, and public discourse. In conclusion, the conquistadors' relentless pursuit of riches and glory irrevocably changed the course of history. They were agents of transformation, expanding the Spanish Empire to unprecedented heights, introducing new cultures and products to both hemispheres, and shaping the destinies of countless indigenous peoples. Their legacy, a complex tapestry of heroism and brutality, ambition and exploitation, continues to elicit debate and reflection. The conquistadors' story serves as a poignant reminder of the multifaceted nature of human history and the enduring questions it raises about the interplay of ambition, power, and humanity in the age of exploration. More information and facts. Technological advancements. The conquistadors' remarkable journeys into the New World were made possible, in part, by a confluence of technological advancements and innovations that revolutionized the age of exploration during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. These technological strides fundamentally altered the capabilities and ambitions of European navigators and played a pivotal role in enabling the conquistadors to undertake their audacious expeditions. Ship design and construction. Caravels. At the forefront of the conquistadors' technological arsenal were ships known as caravels. These vessels represented a significant advancement in maritime engineering. Caravels were characterized by their distinctive features, including a combination of square and lateen sails, a shallow draft, and a robust hull construction. This design allowed for greater maneuverability, especially in shallow coastal waters, and facilitated navigation against prevailing winds. Improved rigging. Caravels featured advanced rigging systems that enabled the ships to sail closer to the wind. This innovation enhanced their ability to navigate efficiently and make progress even when sailing against adverse wind conditions. Lateen sails. Lateen sails, triangular in shape, provided increased control and maneuverability. This was especially advantageous when navigating through narrow channels or challenging coastal environments. Navigation instruments on board. These ships were equipped with an array of navigation instruments, including astrolabes, quadrants, crossstaffs, and compasses. These devices allowed sailors to determine their latitude and, to some extent, longitude, providing a means to chart their course with greater precision. Navigation tools. Astrolabe. The astrolabe was a critical instrument for determining the latitude of a ship's position. By measuring the angle between a celestial body, typically the sun or a star, and the horizon, mariners could calculate their latitude. This enabled more accurate navigation and helped conquistadors maintain their course and explore new territories. Compass. The magnetic compass was a game changer in navigation. It provided a reliable means of determining direction, irrespective of celestial observations or weather conditions. The compass helped conquistadors maintain a consistent heading, crucial for long sea voyages and coastal exploration. Crossstaff and quadrant. These instruments allowed navigators to measure the angle between a celestial body and the horizon. By comparing these measurements with known data or celestial tables, mariners could determine their latitude accurately. Indigenous knowledge and adaptation. Indigenous navigation expertise. The conquistadors were quick to recognize the value of indigenous knowledge and navigation techniques. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, such as the Polynesians and Arawaks, possessed considerable expertise in navigation. They had developed techniques for reading ocean currents, cloud formations, and the behavior of seabirds. Conquistadors, including Christopher Columbus and Hernan Cortés, often relied on indigenous navigators and interpreters, recognizing their invaluable contributions to successful voyages. Canoes and watercraft. In some regions, conquistadors made use of indigenous watercraft, such as canoes and dugout boats, which were well suited for navigating rivers, swamps, and shallow coastal areas. These indigenous vessels allowed for the exploration of regions inaccessible to European-style ships. The amalgamation of these technological advancements, coupled with the adaptation of indigenous knowledge, provided conquistadors with a formidable toolkit for exploration and conquest. These tools not only enabled them to venture into the unknown, but also to navigate and chart the intricate coastlines and river systems of the Americas. Furthermore, the integration of these technological innovations and cross-cultural exchanges played a crucial role in the broader narrative of European expansion and the encounter between the Old World and the New. Indigenous allies and intermediaries. The conquests of the Americas by the conquistadors were not solely the product of European ambition and military might. A critical, and often underappreciated, aspect of these conquests was the indispensable role played by indigenous allies and intermediaries. These individuals, such as Malintzin, also known as La Malinche, in the case of Hernan Cortés, and the Tlaxcalans in the broader context of Spanish colonization, constituted a complex and essential dimension of the conquests, offering a nuanced perspective on this transformative era in history. Malintzin, La Malinche, and Hernan Cortés. Early life. Malintzin, born around 1500 in what is now Mexico, was of noble indigenous descent, but had been enslaved by indigenous rivals. Her fluency in multiple indigenous languages, including Nahuatl and Maya, made her an invaluable asset to Cortés. Her original Nahua name, Malintzin, was later Hispanicized to Marina, and then further shortened to Malinche. Bilingualism. Malintzin's ability to serve as a translator and mediator between Cortés and indigenous leaders played a pivotal role in the conquest of the Aztec Empire. She facilitated communication and negotiation, helping to form alliances with indigenous groups who had grievances against the Aztecs. Her linguistic skills allowed Cortés to gather crucial intelligence about the political and military landscape of the region. Strategic advisor. Beyond her linguistic role, Malintzin was a strategic thinker who provided counsel to Cortés. She was instrumental in devising diplomatic strategies, including the use of gifts and alliances that furthered Cortés's ambitions. Cultural mediator. Malintzin also played a role in mediating cultural encounters, helping to bridge the gap between Spanish and indigenous worldviews. Her position as both insider and outsider in indigenous society allowed her to navigate the complexities of cross-cultural interactions. Legacy and controversy. Malintzin's legacy is complex and often debated. Some view her as a traitor to her own people for aiding the Spanish, while others see her as a survivor who navigated treacherous circumstances. Her story is a testament to the fraught choices faced by individuals caught in the vortex of conquest. Tlaxcalans and Spanish allies. Alliance with Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans, a powerful indigenous group in central Mexico, formed a critical alliance with the Spanish under Cortés. Their hostility toward the Aztecs, stemming from past conflicts, made them eager allies in the Spanish quest to overthrow Aztec rule. Military support. Tlaxcalan warriors fought alongside the Spanish in the pivotal battles against the Aztecs, including the siege of Tenochtitlan. Their military prowess and knowledge of local terrain were indispensable to the Spanish conquest. Integration into Spanish society. As a reward for their support, the Tlaxcalans were granted certain privileges within the Spanish colonial system. Many Tlaxcalans integrated into Spanish society, contributing to the complex process of cultural fusion and mestizaje that characterized colonial Mexico. Impact on indigenous societies. The Tlaxcalans' decision to ally with the Spanish had lasting consequences for indigenous societies in Mexico. It contributed to the subjugation of the Aztec Empire and reshaped the political landscape of the region. The role of indigenous allies and intermediaries in the conquests of the Americas challenges simplistic narratives of European domination and indigenous victimization. These individuals and groups were active participants in shaping the outcomes of conquest, driven by their own motivations, grievances, and strategies. Their actions were instrumental in facilitating the conquistadors' objectives, and their contributions had far-reaching implications for the histories of both indigenous and European societies. Epidemics. The devastating impact of diseases brought by the conquistadors, including smallpox, measles, and influenza, stands as one of the most tragic and transformative aspects of the encounter between the Old World and the New. These diseases, which were entirely new to indigenous populations in the Americas, had catastrophic effects that reshaped demographic, social, and cultural landscapes in ways that are still felt today. Introduction to epidemics and disease transmission. The conquistadors unknowingly carried with them a deadly arsenal of pathogens that had evolved in the densely populated societies of Eurasia and Africa over millennia. While they had developed some immunity through exposure, these diseases were virtually unknown to indigenous peoples in the Americas, leaving them highly susceptible to infection. The pathogens, primarily transmitted through respiratory droplets and direct contact, thrived in the crowded and often unsanitary conditions of European cities and ships. Smallpox, the silent killer. Smallpox, caused by the variola virus, was one of the deadliest diseases introduced by the conquistadors. It was highly contagious and had a mortality rate of up to 30%, making it a formidable killer. As the Spanish and other Europeans came into contact with indigenous populations, smallpox began to spread rapidly, often in epidemic waves. Devastation. The impact of smallpox was nothing short of catastrophic. Entire communities were decimated as the virus swept through indigenous settlements with alarming speed. The disease's high mortality rate meant that death tolls in affected areas were staggering. Demographic collapse. Smallpox led to a demographic collapse of unprecedented proportions. Indigenous populations, with no prior exposure or immunity, faced a level of mortality that undermined their ability to sustain their societies and cultures. The loss of skilled laborers, leaders, and individuals crucial to the functioning of communities resulted in profound social dislocation. Cultural and social disruption. Beyond the immediate death toll, smallpox and other diseases wrought cultural and social disruption. Traditional social structures and religious practices that revolved around communal rituals and healing were severely disrupted, leading to a sense of helplessness and despair. Measles and influenza. Silent but lethal. Measles and influenza, while perhaps less well known than smallpox, were also deadly killers introduced by the conquistadors. Measles, caused by the measles virus, was highly contagious and had a mortality rate among indigenous populations comparable to smallpox. Its rapid transmission exacerbated the devastation. Influenza, caused by influenza A and B viruses, similarly spread quickly through indigenous communities. It was notorious for its ability to mutate, making it challenging to predict and combat. Recurrent waves of influenza caused repeated mortality among indigenous populations, reshaping demographic and social landscapes. The impact of these diseases was not limited to immediate mortality, but had profound and lasting effects on indigenous societies. Population decline. Indigenous populations in the Americas experienced precipitous declines. Some estimates suggest that as much as 90% of the pre-contact indigenous population perished due to a combination of diseases, violence, and societal disruption. Displacement and abandonment. Entire regions were depopulated as survivors fled affected areas. sometimes leaving behind entire settlements. This led to a reconfiguration of territorial boundaries and an upheaval in established patterns of settlement and agriculture. Social disruption. Traditional leadership structures were undermined, often leaving a void that was exploited by conquering European powers. Social hierarchies, familial structures, and religious practices were profoundly disrupted. Cultural loss. The loss of individuals with specialized knowledge, including healers, artisans, and cultural custodians, had a profound impact on the preservation of indigenous cultures and traditions. Labor shortages. The labor force, essential for agricultural production and resource extraction, was severely depleted. This prompted the enslavement of indigenous peoples and the introduction of coerced labor systems. Long-term consequences and historical memory. The devastating impact of diseases brought by the conquistadors had profound long-term consequences, including demographic shifts, cultural transformations, and labor systems that would persist for centuries. The scars left by these epidemics are still visible in the demographic composition, cultural memory, and historical narratives of the Americas today. Economic implications. The conquests of the Americas by the conquistadors had far-reaching economic implications that reverberated throughout the 16th century and beyond. These implications were particularly marked by the influx of precious metals, notably gold and silver, into the Spanish crown's coffers. The massive quantities of bullion extracted from the New World significantly impacted European economies, monetary systems, trade, and ultimately the course of global history. The treasure fleets and the bullion flow. The discovery of vast reserves of gold and silver in the Americas, particularly in regions like Mexico and Peru, inaugurated a period of extraordinary wealth accumulation for the Spanish crown. The most famous sources of these precious metals were the mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and the Cerro Rico, which supplied immense quantities of silver. The process of extracting these metals was labor-intensive, involving the exploitation of indigenous labor through systems like the Maida. Treasure fleets. The wealth of the New World was transported to Spain on massive treasure fleets known as the flota. These fleets, laden with gold, silver, and other valuable goods, crossed the Atlantic Ocean to Seville, Cadiz, and other Spanish ports. The bullion transported on these vessels was of staggering proportions. The impact on European economies. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas had several profound economic implications for Europe. Price revolution. One of the most immediate effects was the price revolution, a period of inflation that lasted for much of the 16th century. The large influx of precious metals into the European economy, combined with a growing population and increased demand for goods, led to rising prices for commodities, land, and labor. Monetary effects. The influx of bullion also had significant effects on monetary systems. The Spanish crown minted vast quantities of coins, including the famous Spanish dollar, or pieces of 8. These coins became widely used in international trade and were instrumental in establishing Spain as a dominant economic power in the 16th century. Spanish economic dominance. Spain, as the primary beneficiary of the New World's wealth, became one of the wealthiest and most influential nations in Europe during this period. The wealth acquired from the Americas enabled Spain to wage wars, engage in international diplomacy, and exert considerable influence in European affairs. Effects on other European powers. The flow of precious metals from the Americas created a competitive race among European powers to establish their own overseas colonies and sources of wealth. This drive for empire building and resource extraction led to a broader era of European expansion and colonization, transforming the geopolitical landscape. Trade and economic transformation. The impact of the conquests extended beyond Spain and Europe. The flow of bullion into European economies influenced global trade patterns and economic development. Global trade networks. The abundance of precious metals spurred European investment in long-distance trade networks, including the Atlantic slave trade, which connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. European powers sought to maximize the economic potential of their overseas colonies, fostering the growth of trade routes and commercial networks. Economic diversification. The influx of wealth enabled European economies to diversify beyond traditional feudal structures. The expansion of commercial enterprises, including banking and manufacturing, contributed to the growth of capitalism and the emergence of early modern economic systems. Enduring impact and historical legacy. The economic implications of the conquests continued to shape the course of history in the centuries that followed. The massive transfer of wealth from the Americas to Europe played a crucial role in the emergence of modern capitalism, the rise of European colonial empires, and the global interconnectedness that characterizes the contemporary world. Religious syncretism. The process of religious syncretism that unfolded in the wake of the conquistadors' arrival in the Americas represents one of the most intriguing and complex aspects of the encounter between indigenous belief systems and Christianity. This dynamic process resulted in the creation of unique hybrid religious practices, iconography, and spiritual traditions that continue to shape the religious and cultural landscape of the Americas. Indigenous spirituality before the conquest. Prior to the arrival of the conquistadors, indigenous peoples of the Americas had developed intricate and diverse belief systems rooted in their deep connections to the natural world, ancestors, and cosmic forces. These belief systems often featured polytheism, animism, and complex mythologies that varied from region to region. Indigenous religious practices were deeply embedded in daily life, influencing everything from agriculture to governance. The arrival of Christianity. The Spanish conquistadors, driven by religious fervor and the desire to spread Christianity, brought with them Catholicism, a monotheistic faith with its own rich traditions, rituals, and iconography. They viewed the conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity as a central mission of their colonial enterprise. However, the encounter between these two religious traditions was not a simple imposition of one over the other, but rather a complex interplay. Religious syncretism in the Americas. The process of religious syncretism unfolded over centuries and manifested in various ways. Integration of indigenous deities. In some cases, indigenous deities were integrated into Christian religious practice. Indigenous gods and goddesses were often syncretized with Christian saints. For example, the Aztec god Huitzilopochtli became associated with Saint James, resulting in a fusion of religious iconography. Blending of rituals. Indigenous rituals and ceremonies were incorporated into Christian religious festivals. This blending of traditions allowed indigenous communities to maintain elements of their ancestral spirituality while outwardly adhering to Christianity. Hybrid religious art. Indigenous artisans created Christian religious art that incorporated indigenous symbolism and techniques. This led to the emergence of unique religious iconography, such as the Black Christ of Esquipulas in Guatemala, which blended indigenous and Christian symbolism. Local variations. Syncretism manifested differently in various regions, reflecting the diversity of indigenous cultures and the adaptability of Catholicism. In some areas, indigenous practices remained more visible, while in others, they became deeply interwoven with Catholicism. Saints and deities. Saints and deities often acquired overlapping characteristics. For example, the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico, one of the most revered figures in Latin American Catholicism, is seen by many as a manifestation of the indigenous goddess Tonantzin. This syncretic figure holds immense cultural and religious significance. Resistance and persistence. It's important to note that the process of religious syncretism was not uniformly embraced by indigenous communities. Many resisted conversion and held on to their traditional beliefs in the face of pressure from European colonizers. Indigenous resistance often took covert forms, with people practicing their traditional rituals in secret while outwardly conforming to Christian norms. Contemporary legacy. The legacy of religious syncretism is palpable in the religious and cultural practices of the Americas today. Hybrid religious traditions and iconography continue to thrive, reflecting the enduring vitality of indigenous belief systems alongside Christianity. This syncretic legacy also plays a role in contemporary discussions of identity, spirituality, and cultural revival among indigenous communities.